New places, new perspectives, same questions, better answers. I'm Rowan Vale, and this is where learning becomes identity. Over the course of this series so far, we've explored how language learning can transform not only how we communicate, but how we understand ourselves. We've talked about access and opportunity. We've explored identity development. We've discussed race, ethnicity, and what happens when our assumptions travel across borders. But identity is never just one thing. When students move between cultures, whether they study abroad, learn languages, travel, or simply encounter new communities, they often discover something unexpected. The rules they thought were universal aren't. Ideas about masculinity and femininity, expectations around sexuality, ways of expressing ourselves, ways of belonging. All of these vary across cultures, and sometimes encountering those differences changes how we understand ourselves. Today, we're exploring identity performance across cultures and asking a simple question: who do we become when the familiar rules disappear? Let's explore. Let's begin today by thinking about gender's hidden rules. Most of us grow up believing the social norms around us are natural, not cultural, natural. The way women act, the way men act. The expectations attached to appearance, relationships, emotion, and expression. These often feel so normal that we rarely stop to question them. But student development scholars remind us that identity does not emerge in isolation. Karen Josselson argues that identity develops through an ongoing interaction between the self and society. In other words, who we become is shaped not only by personal choices, but by the possibilities our culture makes available to us. For many students, crossing cultures reveals this reality for the first time. A student studying abroad may notice men expressing affection towards friends in ways that would be considered unusual at home. Another student may encounter very different expectations around dating, family obligations, or emotional expression. And suddenly, a realization emerges. Maybe what I thought was personality was partly culture. Identity begins to feel less fixed and more contextual. The assumptions we inherited become visible, and once they're visible, they can be questioned. In terms of what I research, I think that a new language can lead to a new self. And language learners often discover this before anyone else. Because language isn't just vocabulary, it's social behavior, it's identity. As someone who has spent years studying Japanese, I've experienced this firsthand. Japanese constantly asks speakers to consider relationships. Who is older? Who has more authority? How close are two people? What level of formality is appropriate? The language itself reflects social expectations, and in many cases, it also reflects expectations about gender. Different speech patterns may be associated with masculinity, femininity, age, or social position. Learning the language means learning these social cues, but it also raises a deeper question: who am I in this language? Am I the same person when speaking Japanese that I am when I speak English? Or am I performing a different version of myself? Student development scholars often describe identity as something that evolves through experience. Language learning accelerates that process because it places students into entirely new social worlds. The learner isn't simply memorizing grammar, they're experimenting with new ways of being, and every interaction becomes a small act of identity exploration. To bring this back to the core of this week's module, I want to talk about coming out, belonging, and finding community. Questions of identity become even more complex when we consider sexuality. For decades, scholars attempted to explain sexual identity development through stage based models. One well known example is Vivian Cass's model of sexual identity formation. Cass describes a process that moves from identity confusion towards identity synthesis, where sexuality becomes integrated into a broader sense of self. But later scholars argued that identity development is rarely that neat. Anthony DeGelli proposed a different perspective. Rather than fixed stages, DeGelli emphasized processes, relationships, communities, and life experiences. According to DeGelli, sexual identity develops through interactions with family, friends, institutions, and social environments. This perspective becomes especially important when students cross cultural boundaries. Some students encounter communities abroad where they feel safer expressing themselves than they ever did at home. Others experience the opposite. The meaning of sexuality changes depending on social context. The risks change, the opportunities change, the sense of belonging itself changes. And so identity development becomes deeply connected to place, not simply who we are, but where we are and who is around us. This leads us into understanding why names and pronouns matter, and I would add tremendously. If identity develops through social interaction, then institutions play a larger role than we sometimes realize. Something as simple as a name can shape a student's experience. The American Association of Collegiate Registrars and Admission Officers, known as AACRAO, Student Identity Report reminds us that names are central to identity and that being identified incorrectly can create feelings of exclusion, embarrassment, or even danger for some students. Similarly, EduCause, a nonprofit association whose mission is to lead the way in advancing the strategic use of technology and data in higher education, argues that institutions should support preferred names, pronouns, and gender identities because doing so helps create safe and equitable educational environments. Now, at first glance, these might seem like administrative details. Database fields, forms, student records, but student development theory encourages us to look a little deeper. Behind every policy is a message about who belongs, a message about who is seen, a message about whether students are allowed to define themselves. Identity development does not occur separately from institutional structures. Institutions help create the environments where identity exploration becomes possible or impossible. To wrap up today, I think that there is a question behind every identity journey. Across cultures, across languages, across identities, one question keeps appearing. Can I be myself here? Students ask this question when they arrive on campus, when they study abroad, when they learn a new language, when they enter unfamiliar communities. The AACRAO report also notes that belonging and student success are deeply connected. Students thrive when they feel recognized, welcomed, and affirmed. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson behind every identity development. Identity is not merely discovered, it's negotiated, tested, performed, revised, and strengthened through our interactions with others. The goal is not to find a single, permanent version of ourselves. The goal is to develop the confidence to navigate different worlds while remaining authentic to who we are becoming. Because ultimately, the most important thing we learn from crossing cultures may not be who other people are, it may be who we are. All right, so far we've explored how language learning intersects with access, identity, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. We've seen that crossing cultures can challenge our assumptions about who we are and where we belong. But identity is only part of the story. Because when students encounter new languages, new communities, and new ways of living, they don't just learn new things. They begin to think differently. They encounter ambiguity. They discover that people can interpret the same experiences in radically different ways. They realize that the answers that they once considered obvious may not be so simple after all. In other words, language learning doesn't just change identity, it changes how we make meaning of the world. Next time, we'll explore cognitive development and ask a new question. What happens when students discover knowledge itself is more complex than they originally once believed? I'm Rowan Vale. Until next time, Stay curious about who you're becoming.